Thank you, Carl. So Carl's run through the risks on the tax revenue side. The second half of the Chancellor's plan for achieving a budget surplus by 2019 is through a significant cut to public spending as a share of national income. And the latest plans from the government suggest that public spending will be cut back as a share of national income to the lowest level that will have been seen for over 60 years, with the exception of the period in 1999 and 2000, at the end of the previous squeeze on spending by the Labour government in their first term. And a significant part in this cut in overall spending is going to be delivered by a cut in public service spending, which similarly will be cut back to around the level it was at in 1999 and 2000, but lower than at any other period for about 60 years. But in fact, it looks even starker than that. If we strip out spending on healthcare, it means that spending on public services outside of health will be at a lower level since at least 1948. One area of spending that will grow over the next few years is spending on debt interest payments, but there will be cuts to other areas of spending, in particular on social security spending. If we look at spending on pensioner benefits, measured on the right-hand axis here, those are going to fall slightly as a share of national income over the next few years, and that reflects a combination of rising real-term spending per pensioner, but a declining number of pensioners as we see the state pension age for both men and women continue to rise over the next few years. Looking at spending on working age benefits, those are going to fall much more significantly over the next few years, getting down to a level that we haven't seen since around 1990. So turning first to public service spending, if we look at the spending review from November, that set out a plan for departmental spending by central government for real terms cuts over the next 4 years of 2.3%. And that comes on top of a slightly more than 10% cut over the last 5 years. But that means that the average rate of cuts over the next few years is going to be significantly slower than what we saw over the last Parliament. But the pain is far from evenly distributed across different spending areas. In advance of the spending review, we knew that 4 areas of departmental spending were going to be relatively protected. Those were health, education, defence and international development. And indeed, it was the case that those 4 departments saw less than the average cut. And for health, education and international development, that came on top of less than the average cut over the last Parliament as well. One of the other departments that did relatively well in the spending review that perhaps we might not have anticipated was the Department for Transport, which saw a significant increase in its capital budget in particular. So it's done actually pretty well out of the last spending review. But that means that the average cuts seen to a number of other larger departments are much larger than the average. And in particular, you can see, for example, the Ministry of Justice seeing around a further 15% cut to its budget, bringing its total cut since 2010 up to around 45% in real terms. But these figures for cuts to departmental spending actually slightly overstate the cuts to public service spending overall, because some public services are also funded through locally raised revenues, in particular council tax. So if we add in those locally raised revenues and look at the total cut to departmental spending plus local authority self-financed expenditure, that suggests a cut to public service spending over the next 4 years of around 1% in real terms rather than 2.3%. And that would come on top of around an 8% cut that we saw over the last Parliament. So a significant part of George Osborne's plan for achieving a budget surplus in 2019 is being delivered through these planned cuts to public services. And I guess that raises the question of whether these cuts are actually going to be deliverable. There are a couple of reasons why we might be sanguine about the prospects for achieving these cuts over the next few years. Firstly, as I said, the average pace of cuts over the next 4 years will be significantly slower than we saw over the last Parliament. That may make them easier to achieve. Secondly, if we look at what happened over the last Parliament, actually departments tended on average to underspend their allocated budgets. So in a period where we saw there was significant political will to deliver those cuts to public service spending, actually ministers and departments did stick to the hard targets that they were set for them. So perhaps that's one reason to think that over the next few years, if we continue to see the political will to cut spending, actually departments will fall in line. Although it's worth saying that the OBR's forecast for borrowing in 2019 is already predicated on the assumption that departments will underspend their budgets to the tune of £4 billion in that year. But clearly there are some risks to delivering on these plans, not least because they come on top of already 5 years of cuts to many of these departments. So one potential risk is that it seems very likely that the cuts that were delivered first are probably the ones that were easiest to identify and easiest to deliver. So the risk is that going forwards, if departments need to make further cuts, it may be harder to identify those things, and they may have to be to areas of services that are more noticeable and more difficult to cut. Secondly, it's worth saying that the figures I just showed you for total real-term spending cuts may actually understate the pressures facing many departments, because there will be rising demand for most public services over the next few years, not least because the population is expected to grow. So if we look at total spending on departments and local authority self-financed expenditure, that's forecast to be cut by 1% in real terms over the next 4 years. But over that period, the population is going to grow by 2.8%. And that means that cuts to per person spending will actually be 3.8% in real terms over the next 4 years. So population growth is going to add to the pressures facing most departments. In addition, the population is not only growing, but it's also getting older, and that will put particular pressure on some areas of public services that are more heavily focused on the older population, and that's in particular healthcare and social care. So looking then at the NHS budget, I showed you in the previous graph that NHS spending is going to be increased by 6.1% in real terms over the next 4 years. Now, it's worth saying in historical context, actually, that 6.1% increase is already a much slower rate of growth than the NHS has been used to. If we look back to the period from 1974 up to the crisis, on average, NHS spending grew by over 4% in real terms each year. So this 6% growth is already quite a slow pace of growth for the NHS. If, in addition, we account for population growth of 2.8%, that suggests that per capita spending on the NHS will grow much more quickly. On top of that, we can take account of the fact that actually spending per person is much higher on people who are older than on people who are younger. So if we adjust for the age profile of NHS spending that we've seen in the past, then in fact a measure of age-adjusted per capita spending suggests that NHS spending will be growing by only 1.3% a year in real terms. And that 1.3% growth, of course, has to deliver all of the ambitions that the current government has in terms of NHS services, including 7-day-a-week NHS, any increase in salaries for doctors and for nurses. So certainly it won't be easy to achieve those savings and will require significant productivity improvements in the NHS to achieve that. And as I just suggested for the NHS, one pressure facing all public services potentially will be to continue to recruit and retain the right sort of staff while trying to keep down overall costs. And the government has already announced that they will impose a 4-year 1% pay cap on pay growth in the public sector. And this continues in a period of low growth in public sector pay over the last Parliament. But it's likely to be the case that holding down public sector pay may become harder over the next few years as we expect pay growth in the private sector to take off more quickly. So to give you a sense of that, this graph shows you the pay differential between the public and private sector, so the difference in average pay in the public sector compared to the private sector over time. The vertical axis here, the positive numbers mean that average pay in the public sector is higher than in the private sector. I don't want you to fixate too much on the level of this line because there are reasons why you might expect average pay in the public sector to be higher than in the private sector, not least because the average skill level of jobs in the public sector tends to be higher. But it's interesting to look at how this line has evolved over time. So showing you the evolution since 1994, what happened under the last Labour government was we saw a steady increase in public sector pay premium, and that was obviously at a time when the public sector was actively expanding and actively trying to increase the number of people employed. Over the last Parliament, we then saw essentially a plateauing of this pay differential, and this reflected restraint on public sector pay growth, but also a period when private sector wages were not growing very strongly either. If we project forward, taking account of the 1% pay cap planned for the public sector for the next 4 years, combined with the OBR's forecast for growth in private sector wages, the result is that it suggests that this public sector pay premium will fall to a significantly lower level than we've seen certainly since the early 1990s. And as I say, perhaps suggesting that it will be harder to recruit, retain and motivate staff in the public sector whilst holding down pay in this way. There are a few other additional costs to additional employment costs facing public sector employers. Perhaps the biggest one here is that from April this year, we will end contracting out of defined benefit pension schemes. That has two important effects. For employees, that means that they will no longer get a NICS rebate. That means their take-home pay will be cut by up to £480 a year. For public sector employers, they will similarly not get an employer's NICS rebate, and that's going to increase employment costs for the public sector as a whole by an estimated £3.3 billion a year from April. A few other pressures include the national living wage, the new apprenticeship levy, and additional commitments to employ apprentices, which may affect some public sector employers. Turning then to social security spending, part of the cut to overall spending is going to be delivered by a £9 billion real terms cut to social security spending, and this comprises a £1 billion increase in pensioner benefits, but a £10 billion cut in working age benefits. And so I think the risks perhaps focus on the working age benefit side, because that's where the significant cuts are really being sought. Now, as Carl mentioned, in theory, the Chancellor has a welfare cap that limits growth in working age benefits. But as Carl already said, this is already being breached in the next 3 years, and so perhaps in practice this cap doesn't really place much practical constraint on welfare spending, and therefore there is a risk that this area of spending could overshoot. So there are a few risks facing spending on working age benefits. One is that the current plan is to freeze benefit rates in nominal terms for the next 4 years. This will mean that we're seeking to cut benefit rates in real terms for a sustained period. We haven't seen this done at all in the last 30 years, although it's worth saying that no previous government has attempted to do this, so it remains to be seen whether, if one attempts to, one actually does it. Secondly, it might be that some of the structural reforms that the government is planning continue to take longer to roll out than are expected, or that they deliver fewer savings than are currently expected. One area where we've seen this risk materialise over the last few years has been in the rollout of the disability benefit reforms, in the transfer from disability living allowance to personal independence payments. To give you a sense of what's happened over the last few years, this graph shows successive forecasts from the OBR for the level of disability benefit spending. Starting in December 2013, the OBR was expecting, as a result of this transition from DLA to PIP, that this area of benefit spending would stabilise at around £14 billion a year. Rolling forward over the next 2 years, what's happened is that both the rollout has been slower than was expected, and it has resulted in fewer savings than were initially expected. As a result, spending in this year, for example, is now expected to be £2 billion higher than was forecast a couple of years ago. If that sort of pattern continued to happen, it could lead to further increases in spending on that area. Another area where there's significant uncertainty about how savings will evolve is in the rollout of universal credit. We've obviously seen the rollout of that be delayed over the last few years. However, the effect of this on total spending is actually somewhat ambiguous because it depends on which aspects get delayed on how it affects spending. If certain aspects were delayed, it could actually reduce spending rather than increase spending. The final significant area of public spending is that on debt interest. We obviously saw in November that changes to debt interest costs and to inflation delivered the Chancellor quite a big windfall in November. But obviously going forward, the risks could be either a significant windfall again, or possibly the reverse situation of rising interest rates, rising inflation, leading to higher levels of spending. To give you a sense of scale on that, if there were a 1 percentage point increase or decrease in gilt and short rates from this April, that would lead to an increase or reduction in public spending by 2019 of around £8 billion a year. Similarly, RPI inflation affects the payments that are made on index-linked gilts. If RPI inflation were to increase by 1 percentage point from this April, that could increase spending in 2019 by around £5 billion a year. So it's uncertain at this stage which way those would go, but it's worth saying that changes in debt interest rates or inflation can have quite big effects on the annual level of public spending. So to summarise then what Carl has said and what I've said, the Chancellor is aiming to reduce public sector net debt over the next few years, and his stated fiscal mandate of running surpluses from 2019 onwards really seems to be underpinned by an idea that it's necessary to get public sector net debt down. And there are good reasons why one might want to achieve that. However, the commitment to run surpluses each and every year from 2019-20 onwards is risky, not least because, as Carl said, that if one wants to do that, you either need to aim for quite a large surplus or you run the risk that you will have to make quick adjustments in year if the forecasts turn out not quite as you're expecting. On the revenue side, there are a number of risks, and some of the examples and the particular ones that Carl highlighted were the fact that equity prices have fallen over recent months. That could lead to a downgrade in forecast revenues. There are also currently unfunded manifesto commitments to cut income tax, and if the Chancellor continues to choose not to index fuel duty rates over the next Parliament, that would put additional pressure on revenues. On the spending side, one of the key areas where they're planning to deliver spending cuts is through further squeeze on public services. The first round effect of that, or the first round risk, is perhaps to the quality of public services if there's political will to do the spending cut. Of course, if it becomes difficult to deliver those public service spending cuts without adversely affecting quality, that could then put pressure on the government to increase spending, and that would obviously feed through into borrowing changes. There are also risks to social security spending and to debt interest spending that could push up borrowing over the next few years. Thank you.